Hello there, I'm James Wienholz, and this is the evolution of the horror genre. Horror has played a very important part in my life that we'll get into in a little bit. And who doesn't love a good scary movie? So, let's take a look and see how this awesome genre has progressed. The first horror film in recorded history is George Mills' Les Manners du Diable. As we can see, it's not exactly terrifying by today's standards, but imagine being in the theater when this film first came out. I'm sure it terrorized the patrons and set the path for future horror films to come. Also, right around the dawn of the horror genre, we see Japanese horror emerge. Films like Big Jizo or Shinen no Sosei came out in the early 1900s. It's pretty interesting to think that Japanese horror, which is one of the more popular subgenres today, has been there from the start. Right around this time, we also start to see German filmmakers get involved with Wagner's The Golem trilogy from 1950 to 1920, Robinson's Warning Shadows in 1923, and our first look at this iconic character, which terrified moviegoers in 1922. Nosferatu was the first vampire movie in recorded history, and it's also worth noting it was an unauthorized adoption of Bram Stoker's iconic novel. Another iconic moment in the horror genre is when Universal starts making their horror films. Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923 and Phantom of the Opera in 1925 are iconic in their own right, but they are also very important because these films paved the way for these iconic characters to enter into the silver screen. Some of the more classic Universal horror films came out in the 30s as well, like Bela Lugosi in Dracula or Boris Karloff in Frankenstein. Rounding out all these films was 1941's Wolfman from Universal Studios. When I think of classic horror, as I'm sure millions of people do as well, they think of these classic films by Universal Studios really putting a huge staple into the horror genre. Soon after Universal puts their footprint on the horror genre, we see Paramount and MGM get heavily involved. Paramount's horror film Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde broke ground because it showed the full transformation on screen, while MGM's movie Freaks was often regarded as being controversial for showing real humans in that nature. In the early 50s, we start to see the result of World War II with atomic monsters that spawn from radioactivity like Godzilla. We also see the first 3D horror film with The House of Wax, and some gimmicky things like putting buzzers in the seats for movies like The Tingler. We also see the emergence of Hammer Horror in the studio from the UK, which starred the late great Christopher Lee in many of its films, put their own versions of the classic Universal horror monsters onto the silver screen. One of the most iconic horror films of all time came out of the late 60s, and it's Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, starring Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates. While this film won't be considered a slasher by most, it definitely laid the groundwork for future films like Carpenter's Halloween or Friday the 13th that we'll talk to in a little bit, as Norman Bates stalked his victims in the showers of the Bates Motel. We now transition into the 60s with one of the highlights definitely being George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. which grossed $35 million with its gothic style, showing again that a horror movie can be extremely popular, just being spooky and without a whole lot of gore. So in the late 60s, demonic horror films start to become a big deal. Films like The Exorcist, The Omen, and Rosemary's Baby show us what it would be like to be possessed or carry the Antichrist, or have a child that could be the Antichrist. This array of themes remains popular still to this day. Breaking into the 70s, now we see a rise of Italian horror filmmakers like Dario Argento come onto the scene with his film Suspiria. Suspiria is so different because of its color palette. It really changed the way that horror directors used the lighting after this film came out, and is very intriguing to sit and watch and contemplate the decisions he made when he made the film. Rick Baker would win an Oscar for his makeup on American Werewolf in London, really making horror noticed to a whole nother level with that design. Also very popular in this time frame are horror comedies like Rocky Horror Picture Show and Young Frankenstein. Even to this day, people love dressing up and going to see Rocky Horror Picture Show at midnight, showcasing how popular it still is. The 70s also give us some of the most iconic horror characters of all time. Michael Myers with John Carpenter's Halloween really sets the pace and the rules and the structure of slasher films to come in the following decades. Following that film, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, all follow the structure that Halloween sets up, but they all are unique in their shooting styles, looks, and villains, and still to this day are some of the most loved horror franchises of all time. Also coming out of the 70s was the film Jaws, which broke new ground in a lot of different ways. The way that it was filmed, and the way that it instilled a fear of something very real in people. For years after this film came out, people were afraid to get into the water at a beach. Some people still are, for fear that a man-eating great white shark may be lurking under the surface. To cap off this great time period for horror in the 70s, we start to see Stephen King's novels be adapted into film. Here we see The Shining with Jack Nicholson, directed by Stanley Kubrick, which got some controversy because King hated it, but it is highly regarded as one of the best horror films of all time for a huge list of reasons. Also coming out of the 70s was an adaptation of Carrie starring Sissy Spacek. This really did cap off what was the golden age for horror films. These were mainly known for their B-horror movies like Gremlins, The Fly, or Evil Dead. These films are loved by a lot of people still, but nowhere near as highly regarded as the films in the horror genre that came out in the 70s. The early 90s introduced us to Hannibal Lecter and Buffalo Bill in a horror film that was truly, truly terrifying with Silence of the Lambs. This movie felt very real and scared a lot of people, thinking that perhaps there was a Buffalo Bill living in their neighborhood. We suffered through some pretty bad horror films in the early 90s, even into the mid-90s. This one definitely wasn't one of them. And soon, two great horror franchises would be coming to close out the decade. And the Blair Witch Project may be two of the highest regarded horror films coming out of the 90s. Scream, because it reinvented the slasher genre. It acknowledged that the prior slashers were actually movies that these kids were fans of, and it references the rules that we all knew about, but no other film before had the courage to go ahead and say that these did exist. Blair Witch Project changed the game again because of its found footage shooting style, but it also appeared on shows like Unsolved Mysteries, making millions of people believe that the Blair Witch was actually a real legend. We enter the 2000s, the new millennium showcases films through early 2000s up to this day, where we like seeing people have to face extreme trials to survive. Like 28 Days Later, The Purge, Saw, all these films become extremely popular after we get to 2000. Horror on television hasn't been this popular since the likes of The Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock Presents. We can thank The Walking Dead for really kicking off this avalanche of horror on television again, like American Horror Story, Ash vs. the Evil Dead, The Walking Dead, Fear the Walking Dead, just to name a few. Horror is very prevalent on television right now. Streaming services have also become extremely popular as people love to watch content on the go on their mobile devices. This has allowed independent horror filmmakers to get their works noticed and distributed by these companies like Netflix or Hulu. This provides us the opportunities to watch awesome horror films like The Babadook or It Follows. In the theater, currently the most popular sub-franchise would have to be the supernatural once again, with films like The Conjuring, Insidious, Sinister, Annabelle, just to name a few. These films showcase again that horror very much does move in a circular fashion, and what was popular decades ago will come back and be popular again. This concludes my Evolution of Horror project. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day.